Imagine a machine, right? It communicates flawlessly in a language, answers questions, tells jokes. Seems like it totally gets it.
Mm-hmm.
But what if? What if inside it understands absolutely nothing, just like an amazing mimic?
That's a fascinating hook.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. We tackle complex stuff, pull out the key bits, add some surprising facts, and hopefully keep you entertained.
Sound good?
Today, we're diving deep into a classic philosophy thought experiment, one that really stirred things up in AI. John Searle's Chinese room argument.
Ah, yes, the Chinese room.
Mhm.
Still debated today.
Exactly. And it's not just about robots, is it? It's really about what it means to understand, to think, to, have a mind.
Absolutely. It cuts right to the core questions.
So if you've ever looked at an AI, maybe ChatGPT or something, and wondered, is it really thinking? Is it conscious? Or is it just, faking it incredibly well?
Mhm.
Then this deep dive is definitely for you. We're going to unpack this whole argument, look at where it came from, what it means today.
Yeah, and its implications are still pretty huge.
Our main source here is the comprehensive Wikipedia entry on the Chinese room. It covers the history, the philosophy, the counterarguments. It's all in there.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah.
Lots of threads to pull on.
So our mission, extract the core ideas, look at the arguments for and against Searle's, let's say, provocative claim,
Provocative is right.
and hopefully leave you with a richer, maybe more nuanced view of intelligence and consciousness itself.
Let's do it.
Okay, so our story starts with the philosopher John Searle. He drops this argument in a 1980 paper, Minds, Brains, and Programs.
A landmark paper, really.
And it's a thought experiment, right? Not a lab test. But it really pokes at our intuitions about computers.
Definitely. It's designed to make you think, wait a minute.
Okay, picture this. You're in a room, alone, and you don't understand a single word of Chinese. Zero.
Got it. Sealed room, no Chinese.
Inside, though, you have this massive book, like a huge instruction manual, all in English, and it gives you super detailed rules. Step-by-step instructions for manipulating Chinese symbols.
Just symbol shuffling, based on rules you do understand, which are in English.
Exactly. So, someone slides Chinese text under the door. Input.
Right.
You look up the symbols in your English rule book, follow the instructions. Maybe you combine symbols, pick out others, rearrange them. Whatever the book says.
Purely following the instructions. Meticulously.
And eventually you produce some new Chinese symbols. Output. You slide those back under the door.
Okay. Input, process according to the rule book, output.
Now here's the kicker. To the Chinese speakers outside the room, your answers are perfect. They seem totally fluent, intelligent, maybe even witty.
Indistinguishable from a native speaker.
Yeah. The system, the room, takes Chinese characters, processes them, spits out answers, and nobody outside can tell it's not a real Chinese speaker in there.
It passes the Turing test for Chinese conversation, essentially.
Right. So the crucial question Searle asks is, does the person inside the room, you, actually understand Chinese?
Well, no. You said, I don't know any Chinese.
Exactly. And does the room as a whole understand Chinese? Or is it all just simulation? Does it have a mind like we do?
And that's the core of Searle's argument. He says, look, from inside the room, you're just manipulating symbols based on their shape, their syntax.
Syntax, okay. The rules about form.
Right. But you have no idea what they mean. There's no semantics, no comprehension.
Like knowing grammatical rules without knowing vocabulary?
Sort of, yeah. Or like shuffling cards according to rules without knowing what hearts or spades actually represent in the game. You just follow the pattern.
Gotcha.
So Searle argues, because you don't understand, and the room is just paper and rules, the whole system doesn't understand Chinese.
And the analogy is?
The analogy is that computers running programs are doing the exact same thing. They're just manipulating symbols based on syntactic rules given by the program.
Without any real understanding.
Without any real understanding, thinking, or consciousness. That's his claim.
Wow. So he's aiming this squarely at, what did he call it? Strong AI.
Exactly. Strong AI. That's the idea that a properly programmed computer with the right inputs and outputs wouldn't just simulate a mind, it would actually have a mind.
In the same way we do.
In exactly the same sense, human beings have minds. That's the strong AI position he's attacking.
And this hits concepts like functionalism, computationalism.
Precisely. Functionalism says mind is about what it does, the function. Computationalism says mind is a computation, a program. Searle's saying, nope, Syntax isn't enough for semantics. You need more than just rules.
Okay, let me try an analogy. It's like, I can follow a recipe perfectly, mix the flour, eggs, sugar, get a great cake.
Right.
But do I understand the chemistry? Why baking soda makes it rise? Do I grasp the meaning of sugar beyond add 2 cups? Probably not.
That's a pretty good analogy. Searle would say the computer is like the baker following the recipe. Perfect execution, zero understanding of the underlying reality.
But hang on, isn't that I don't know, subjective? How does Searle know there's no understanding just because the person inside doesn't feel it? Maybe understanding emerges at the system level.
That's exactly one of the main criticisms the system applied, which we'll definitely get into. But first, it's fascinating that Searle wasn't, totally the first person to hint at this.
Oh, really? There were precursors.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Way back, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1714, I think.
Yeah.
He imagined blowing up the brain to the size of a mill.
A mill, like with gears and stuff.
Exactly. And he walks around inside and says, you see parts pushing each other, but where would you see a thought? Where's the perception?
Huh. That does sound similar. Just mechanical processes.
Very similar intuition. Then much later, 1961, a Soviet cyberneticist, Anatoly Dimprov, he wrote a short story, The Game.
Okay.
He pictured a whole stadium of people acting like switches, memory cells,
Yeah.
to translate a sentence in Portuguese. None of them knew Portuguese.
A whole stadium is a computer.
Right. And his conclusion, even a perfect simulation isn't the thinking itself. Very Searle-like.
Oh.
And then in the 70s, you had others like Lawrence Davis, Ned Block, talking about the China brain or Chinese nation idea. The entire population simulating one mind.
So the basic idea was floating around. What made Searle's version stick?
I think it was the timing, the direct challenge to AI researchers, the focus on syntax versus semantics, and publishing it in a major journal like Behavioral and Brain Sciences. It just landed perfectly to ignite debate.
And Ignite it did. You said it became the journal's most influential target article.
Huge impact. Generated a massive number of replies, critiques, defenses. It really polarized the field.
To the point where people were saying cognitive science's job was basically just to prove Searle wrong.
Yeah, Pat Hayes said something like that, maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it shows how central the argument became. People felt they had to address it. Many thought it was just obviously wrong, but couldn't easily dismiss it.
Okay, so let's really get into that philosophical battleground. Strong AI versus, what's Searle's position called?
Biological naturalism. But first, strong AI. Searle defined it clearly. An appropriately programmed computer would have a mind, just like ours.
Not just simulate it, have it.
Right. And this wasn't just theoretical. Early AI pioneers like Herbert Simon back in '55 were already saying things like, machines that think, that learn and create exist now.
Bold claims.
Very. Some even felt they had solved the mind-body problem. Strong AI implied, maybe we don't even need to study the squishy brain stuff. If it passes the Turing test, if it runs the right program, that's enough.
So the mind is the software, essentially.
That's the connection to computationalism and functionalism. Mental states are computational states. The hardware doesn't matter fundamentally, only the program. Run the program on silicon, or maybe beer cans and string if you could, and you'd get a mind.
Which sounds efficient, but also maybe a bit weird.
It's a powerful idea. And it connects directly to today's LLMs, like ChatGPT. People are asking now, can these things have minds?
Right. The debate is alive and well.
Very much so. You have researchers like Goldstein and Levenstein in 2024 saying, well, LLMs seem to fit some philosophical theories of mental representation, but the evidence for them having actual beliefs and desires, still shaky.
So they process information, but do they believe anything?
That's the question. On the other hand, you've got someone like David Chalmers suggesting in 2023, okay, maybe current LLMs aren't conscious, but give it a decade. With advancements, maybe we could build conscious AI systems, directly challenging Searle.
So the debate rages on, but what about Searle's counter, biological naturalism?
Right, Searle says, hold on. Consciousness, understanding. These aren't just abstract programs. They require specific biological machinery, like the kind found in brains.
So brains cause minds.
That's his famous phrase. Brains cause minds. And he insists that our actual mental experiences depend on the actual physical and chemical properties of our actual brains.
The wetware matters.
The wetware is essential, according to Searle. Now, he doesn't rule out machines having consciousness entirely. He says, we are precisely such machines. We are biological machines.
Okay.
But for another machine, say silicon-based, to be conscious, it would need to replicate the causal powers of the brain. The specific things the brain does physically and chemically, that give rise to consciousness.
Which is a direct hit against functionalism, right? Because function alone isn't enough.
Exactly. It's not just what the system does, it's how it does it and what it's made of. Searle even flips the script and accuses strong AI of being a kind of dualism.
Dualism. Like mind and body are separate, but strong AI is usually materialist.
He argues strong AI implies the mind can be separated from the specific hardware, the brain. It suggests where the mind is concerned, the brain doesn't matter. For Searle, that sounds suspiciously like separating mind from its physical basis.
Huh. That's a clever twist. So when I use ChatGPT, Searle would say, it doesn't matter how smart it seems, it's just symbol manipulation because it doesn't have brain-like causal powers.
That's the essence of it. It's sophisticated pattern matching, syntax processing, but without the underlying biological machinery Searle thinks is necessary for genuine semantics, for actual understanding or consciousness.
Okay. And Searle later shifted the focus a bit more towards consciousness itself, not just understanding.
Yeah, he clarified that while the argument started with understanding and intentionality, mental states being about something, the real target is consciousness.
How did he put that? The rainstorm analogy.
Right. He said, nobody supposes that the computational model of rainstorms in London will leave us all wet. A simulation of rain isn't rain.
Makes sense.
But, he says, they make the mistake of supposing that the computational model of consciousness is somehow conscious. A simulation consciousness, for Searle, isn't consciousness.
Okay, simulation isn't the real thing, but that really pushes the question, what is the real thing, and how could we ever know if a machine had it?
Exactly. And that leads some philosophers, like Colin McGinn, to use the Chinese room to argue that the hard problem of consciousness...
How physical stuff gives rise to subjective experience.
Right. McGinn says the Chinese room suggests that problem might be fundamentally unsolvable for us. Because from the outside, how could you possibly tell if there's real consciousness or just a perfect simulation inside the room?
It seems impossible from the outside.
But Searle pushes back on McGinn. He says, you're missing the point of the thought experiment. We put someone inside. We have the first-person perspective of the guy shuffling symbols.
The guy who knows he doesn't understand Chinese.
Right. And from that perspective, Searle says there's nothing in that system, the rules, the paper, that could plausibly create a new Chinese understanding consciousness. There's just the non-understanding person.
So the internal perspective is key for Searle.
It's crucial to his argument. Okay, so Searle throws down this gauntlet. Naturally, people push back. Hard.
Let's get into those replies. Where did they try to find the mind that Searle says isn't there?
Okay, one of the biggest and earliest is the system reply.
Right. You mentioned this. The idea that the whole room understands.
Exactly. The person inside doesn't, sure. But the person, plus the rule book, the pencils, the database of symbols, that whole system understands Chinese.
What does Searle say to that?
He's pretty dismissive. He says, okay, let the person memorize the entire rule book. Let them internalize all the rules and data. Now the person is the system.
Ah, okay.
Does that person suddenly understand Chinese? Searle says, obviously not. They're still just manipulating symbols internally, following rules without grasping the meaning. The understanding hasn't magically appeared.
So just internalizing the system doesn't solve it for him?
Nope. Then there's a variation, the virtual mind reply, often associated with Marvin Minsky.
Virtual mind, like a virtual machine.
Kind of. The idea is that the computation running on the hardware, the person in the room, could create a separate virtual mind that does understand Chinese, even if the components don't.
Like software creating its own level of reality.
Sort of. But Searle again falls back on his simulation argument. A virtual mind is still just a simulation of a mind. And a simulation of X isn't X. Simulation digestion doesn't digest pizza. Simulation of a mind isn't a mind.
But is a mind like digestion, or is it more like information processing? Nicholas Fern asked that, right? Is it like a rainstorm simulation or a calculator simulation?
That's a great point Fern makes. If you perfectly simulate a calculator performing 2 + 2 = 4, doesn't the simulation actually calculate it? Is the mind more like the calculator where the process is the thing, or like the rainstorm where it's just a model?
That seems like a really fundamental Carlton. Is mind just information patterns?
It is. And Searle's intuition strongly says no. It's tied to the physical substrate.
Okay, what about making it less abstract? Put the room in a robot, the robot reply.
Right. Give the system senses and limbs. Let it interact with the world. Inputs come from cameras, seeing things. Outputs move the robot around. Maybe that's where meaning comes from.
Grounding the symbols in reality. Hans Moravec's idea.
Yeah, proponents argue this provides the causal connection to the world that's missing in the room. The robot interacts with chairs, learns the symbol for chair is linked to the actual object.
Makes intuitive sense. So what's Searle's comeback?
Pretty much the same as before. He says, okay, put the room in a robot head. The inputs are now camera signals. The outputs control motors. But the person inside is still just following the rule book.
Still shuffling symbols based on syntax.
Exactly. The person isn't seeing through the robot's eyes or understanding the environment. They're just getting symbol strings from the camera processor and outputting other symbol strings to the motor controller, according to the rules. Syntax still isn't semantics for the person doing the work.
So adding the body doesn't fix the core problem for Searle.
Not for him.
Yeah.
Okay. Another big one. The brain simulation reply.
This sounds powerful. What if the program doesn't just mimic conversation, but simulates an entire Chinese brain, neuron by neuron?
Right. Every synapse, every firing pattern, perfectly replicated in the software. Surely that would understand.
It feels like it should. How could it not, if it's functionally identical?
Searle uses another analogy here. Imagine instead of a computer, you have a massive, intricate system of water pipes and valves in the room.
Okay, pipes.
Yeah. And the person inside has rules for turning valves on and off, simulating the neuron firings.
Mm-hmm.
Water flows this way and that, perfectly mimicking the brain's activity.
Mm-hmm.
Searle asks, where's the understanding? Is the water understanding Chinese? Is the plumbing conscious? He says, no, it's still just a simulation. And the physical properties of water pipes aren't the physical properties of brains that cause consciousness.
Back to biological naturalism, the stuff matter.
Exactly. Actual physical chemical properties of actual human brains. Though it's fair to point out, modern connectionist AI, deep learning, it's less about rigid symbol rules and more about dynamic patterns across networks. Maybe that's closer.
A different kind of machine than Searle first envisioned.
Potentially. The debate adapts.
There's also the practical issue, right? The sheer speed and complexity.
Oh yeah. Critics jump on this. The human brain is doing billions, maybe trillions of operations per second. The guy in the room with his book.
It would take like millions of years to answer hello.
Probably. Requiring warehouses full of paper. It's absurdly impractical. And critics like the Churchlands say this absurdity undermines Searle's intuition.
How so?
They argue our intuition fails us at these massive scales. Their analogy is trying to create light by waving a magnet. Wave it slowly, nothing happens. But wave it trillions of times per second. You get electromagnetism, you get light. Something fundamentally new emerges.
So maybe consciousness emerges from sheer speed and complexity in the Chinese room, even if our intuition says no.
That's the argument. Maybe Searle's intuition, based on the slow, clunky man in a room, is just unreliable when scaled up massively.
So are we just stuck arguing about intuitions? Or does it get even weirder?
Oh, it gets weirder. Some replies basically say the whole debate is framed wrong, maybe even meaningless.
Meaningless? How?
Well, take the other mind's reply. It points out, how do you know I'm conscious and understand you?
I assume you are. Because you act like it.
Exactly. We judge other people based on their behavior. We can't directly access their subjective experience. So why hold the Chinese room to a higher standard?
We give humans the benefit of the doubt based on behavior.
Right. Alan Turing called it a polite convention. Nilsson had that great quip. Maybe Searle is just behaving as if he's thinking deeply, for all we know.
Okay, fair point. If we can't know for sure about other humans, how can we know about AI?
And if Searle's causal properties of the brain are the only things that matter, but they're undetectable from the outside because the room passes the Turing test,
Then consciousness doesn't affect behavior.
it becomes epiphenomenal, like a shadow that doesn't influence anything. Which leads Daniel Dennett to talk about philosophical zombies.
Zombies, like Walking Dead.
Yeah, no, philosophical zombies. Beings that look, act, talk exactly like conscious humans.
Wow.
But inside, there's nothing. No subjective experience. Lights are on, nobody's home. Dennett argues that if Searle is right about the Chinese room, that behavior doesn't guarantee understanding, then we can't ever rule out that anyone, even ourselves maybe, isn't just a very sophisticated zombie.
So the argument potentially undermines our certainty about all consciousness, not just AI.
It raises that possibility, yeah. And then there's the most radical critique. Eliminative materialism.
Eliminate what?
Eliminate concepts like consciousness or understanding or belief from our scientific vocabulary altogether.
Oh, just get rid of them.
Yeah. Proponents like Dennett argue these are folk psychology terms, useful simplifications, maybe like a user illusion, but not scientifically real categories.
Like how we used to talk about demons causing illness.
Exactly. Once we understood germs, the demon concept was eliminated from medicine. Eliminative materialists think concepts like consciousness will eventually be replaced by a purely neuroscientific account of brain processes.
So if consciousness isn't even real in the way Searle assumes,
Then his whole argument, which starts from the premise that minds have semantics and consciousness, collapses because the starting point is flawed.
wow,
Yeah.
that's a lot to take in. If we can't know other minds, maybe consciousness is an illusion? Is the AI consciousness debate just fundamentally unresolvable?
It certainly highlights how deep the philosophical waters are. And there's one more critique related to Searle's biological focus.
The carbon chauvinism thing.
Right. Accusing Searle of being biased towards carbon-based life, like us. Why should consciousness only arise from the specific chemistry of brains?
Steven Pinker's counter-thought experiment. Aliens made of electronics looking at us.
Yeah, imagine Silicon Alien saying, how could that squishy meat brain possibly be conscious? It flips the perspective.
Does Searle accept that criticism?
He denies being a carbon chauvinist. He says, theoretically, sure, maybe a silicon machine could be conscious if it could replicate the brain's crucial causal powers.
But we don't know what those are yet.
Exactly. He says, until we know how the brain does it, we are not in a position to try to do it artificially. So for him, it's an empirical question still up for grabs, not ruled out in principle, but definitely not achieved by just running code.
Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground here, from the simple room setup
To deep philosophy of mind, AI, consciousness.
the core idea being Searle's challenge. Simulation isn't understanding. Syntax isn't semantics.
And the cascade of replies trying to find the understanding in the system, in a virtual mind, in a robot body, in brain simulation.
Or arguing the question itself is flawed because of other minds, zombies, or even questioning consciousness itself.
It really forces you to grapple with what we mean by mind and whether behavior like passing the Turing test is enough.
Especially now with AI getting so incredibly good at simulation.
The argument feels more relevant than ever, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, the next time you're chatting with an AI, a sophisticated language model, or relying on an AI decision,
Pause for a second.
yeah, pause and consider, is it getting you? Is there meaning behind the words? Or is it just an unbelievably complex pattern matcher, manipulating symbols without a flicker of comprehension?
And maybe the deeper question. If its performance is perfect, does the internal reality or lack thereof actually matter for how we use it?
That's the provocative thought to leave folks with. Doesn't matter at the end of the day.
A question for the future, maybe.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Been fascinating.